One of the horror genre's most iconic killers, Jason Voorhees, is a masked slasher that deserves his own themed commander deck. And who else would be our stand-in for Jason other than Thraximundar? Thraximundar is a zombie assassin in Grixis colors and absolutely slashes up our opponent's creatures. Forcing the defending player to sack a creature is pretty comparable to Jason killing a victim in one of his movies. And also having the bonus ability of whenever a player sacks a creature, we get to boost him up with a +1/+1 counter. We have a powerhouse in the command zone. And what would Jason be without his iconic mask? Looking at the card Killer's Mask, this would be perfect for our Jason deck. Not only does it give us the looks, but it also gives Jason the keyword Menace, making attacking with him even more threatening. Another great card would be Mask of Memory, giving us some late card draw with him, and also giving us the looks of Jason's mask from Jason X. And now what every good slasher needs is a good weapon, and we have plenty of cards to represent them. The most iconic of Jason's weapons is his machete, and Magic has two cards that could easily represent this, in Rusty Machete and Conductive Machete. The only problem being, these cards kinda suck. So let's get more creative with our equipment cards. Going back to part 2, Jason's first ever kill was with an ice pick, and I really like Shadow Spear to represent this kill. It's gonna give Jason lifelink and trample, which is overpowered on its own, but I really like the flavor of the other ability. Shadow Spear lets us pay 1, and we can take away Indestructible and Hexproof from our opponent's creatures, much like how Jason started off his horror career by taking out one of the previous final girls. Another weapon that Jason raked up some kills with was his pitchfork that he used in part 2, 3, and the final chapter. Tarian's Soul Cleaver is a real standout for this deck, giving Jason vigilance but also doubling up on his +1/+1 ability. But my favorite equipment for this deck has to be Nazgul's Battle Mace. It gives Jason Menace, Death Touch, and Annihilator 1, and whenever a creature enters our opponent's graveyard, we can take control of it unless they pay 3 life, which works perfectly with Thraximundar's ability. And now to round out our weapons, obviously a lot of the swords of X and Y can slot right in here, but I think we should move on to some cards that represent other things besides just Jason and his accessories. And what would a Friday the 13th deck be without the first killer, Pamela Voorhees? Pamela was a master manipulator, and even after her death contributed to Jason's killing sprees. And now the perfect card for Pamela would be Marchesa the Black Rose. Giving all of our creatures the dethrone mechanic is a fantastic way to show Pamela talking in Jason's mind even after her death. And her ability that returns creatures that have died with counters on them to the field makes it so that Jason is even harder to remove. And now moving into another great reference to Pamela would be the Relic of Sauron. And now the Relic is a perfect way to show off Jason's shrine to his mother, helping us ramp out Jason quickly and get the slashing started. And now moving into the sub-theme of this deck, it's really going to help synergize with Jason's ability buffing him up, and that's Sacrifice, mostly forcing our opponents to sacrifice their creatures. And now there's a lot of great cards that force only our opponents to sacrifice creatures, but there's also cards that we can play that would even force us to sacrifice, which also helps. Looking at Jason's ability, it states that whenever a player, not just whenever our opponents do, so even whenever we sacrifice a creature, we still get to buff Jason up. And now let's take for example a Cursed Marauder. Let's say that we play it and force every player to sacrifice a creature with Jason on the board. We can actually sacrifice a Cursed Marauder to its own ability, and if every other player had to sacrifice a creature, Jason's gonna get 4 +1/+1 counters. So adding in a lot of cards that have this ability to force every player to sacrifice a creature is really valuable with Jason on the board, where we can play these cards to buff him up, swing in at someone who's open, and likely kill them with commander damage. And now that's gonna bring us into the main weakness of this deck, and that's that it's a monolith commander deck. What I mean by this is that our deck pretty much only functions whenever Jason is on the battlefield, and that's going to bring up 2 different problems. And first off, Jason is 7 mana to cast, so it's extremely important that we're able to ramp out quickly and cast him as soon as possible. And then that leads into the second problem, and that's that if our opponents know that our deck runs through our commander, they're even more likely to counter it or just to remove it on sight. And now for our first problem, our deck is going to be filled with mana rocks and ritual effects. These are going to ensure that we can cast Jason as soon as possible. But even if we do cast him early, that leads directly into our second problem, and that's that our opponents are more likely to remove him or counter him. And now the only way that we can really try to get around this is to pack our own deck with plenty of counter spells, just for the off chance that someone does counter or try to remove him, we can easily stop it. And now that we've gone over a lot of the main cards in the deck and our deck's weakness, let's focus on what the game plan for this deck is. And now the first thing we want to do is ramp out Jason as fast as possible, but not only that. While we're ramping, we also want to play a few value creatures and cast a lot of our value equipment cards, that way we don't have to spend mana to cast them later. And now whenever we go to cast Jason, we want to make sure that our opponents are either tapped out to where they can't counter or remove him, or we have a counterspell in hand. And now once we have Jason out on the battlefield, we're going to move into our second step of our game plan, and that's buffing up Jason. And now this can be either through forcing our opponents or even us to sacrifice a creature, or even playing zombie lords that buff him up and putting equipment on him. And now once we're in a situation where we have Jason out and we're decently buffing him up, we're just going to try to grind out the game. Every turn we're going to be trying to force at least one of our opponents to sacrifice their entire board so that we can swing in with Jason and win off commander damage. And now in the description below, I'm going to have a link for both my Moxfield deck that I use for this video, and also for the proxies that I made so that if you're interested, you can print them off yourself. But be sure to let me know what cards you think I missed in the comments below, and also be sure to like and subscribe for more. But until next time, have a good one.